For years now, people have been complaining about the state of modern filmmaking. From excessive use of CGI to things looking like they're lit in the style of a commercial, audiences and content creators alike have been voicing their complaints and concerns about the film industry as it sits today. But I personally am a little skeptical of that view. Amidst all the criticism, all the yelling about the death of Hollywood, how much is behind these worries? How justified are all of the suggestions that the industry is losing its soul to careless corporations that worry little about anything other than the bottom line, as opposed to the beauty of cinema, that focus purely on quantity over quality? Today, let's investigate these claims and find out together just how much the industry is really changing. Welcome back to Silver Retention. The first thing we need to do is figure out where to focus our investigation, and I think that would benefit from starting at the top, the corporations and the studios. In much of the recent past, we've seen countless articles and social media takes about the corporate greed ruining Hollywood, with the studios being controlled by money-focused people who don't care about art or just don't understand it and only focus on profit. These are valid criticisms of the studio system, but are they really that new? Recently, I rewatched the documentary Empire of Dreams on Disney+. That documentary, second only to the various Jaws behind-the-scenes documentaries, is directly responsible for my fascination and dedication to movies and wanting to be a filmmaker myself. Now, if you watch those documentaries, you will find the most stressful, chaos-ridden, anxiety-inducing stories of all time, at least in my opinion. Spielberg directly states that every night before he went to bed, he was petrified that he'd get a call in the middle of the night from the studio telling him to pack his bags and that his career was going to be over. And Lucas had very much the same fears, with Carrie Fisher telling that it got so bad that he ended up going mute for a series of days on the first Star Wars production. Technical malfunctions, crew difficulties, illness, storms, floods, literal sinking ships. Amidst all this, you might wonder just how in God's name an 8-year-old boy can look at this and say, wow, that's exactly what I want to do. But as Lucas learned from Joseph Campbell himself, these stories of them creating these movies were in and of themselves the perfect representation of the hero's journey. These young men with a dream endured hell to make them a reality, and their stories end with world-changing triumphs. In their tales, they are the eternal hero incarnate, and the gold-hoarding dragon beast they must tame? That was the studios. Early in the runtime of Empire of Dreams, Lucas tells of his early failures with the studio system. They canned his first film, THX 1138, because no one understood it. They shelved American Graffiti because they were petrified that no one would watch it. They didn't do this out of moral objection or artistic integrity, they did it because they couldn't stand the idea of losing money, and with good reason. At that time in the 70s, as George elaborates in the documentary, all of the old studios were dying. Literally. The men who'd created them were either retiring or had passed on. And the places like Warner Brothers, MGM, Paramount, and the other giants of Hollywood were either being broken up or sold off to the highest bidding corporation just in order to stay afloat. And I'm sure you're sitting there thinking, this sounds a little familiar. And you would be right. Like George always likes to say, it's like poetry, it rhymes. So here we find ourselves in the 2020s, going through new versions of the same story. The old studio systems are dying, and the corporations are swooping in to cash out as much as they can. And that means, as it has throughout the history of Hollywood, that the dollar comes first. That has been true since the first theater opened, and it'll be true until the last streaming service has died. So if that's not what's changing, then what exactly has? The next argument comes from an analysis of modern production standards. And there are a lot of variables to take into account here, and I want to go through each of them bit by bit. The first might be the most prolific, that digital has killed the feel of film, or that CGI is ruining immersion. Everything looks like it's lit like a commercial, some people are saying. All of these are interesting and valid objections, but let's see just how much truth is behind them, and maybe add a little bit of nuance into this argument. First, film versus digital. Plenty of discourse has been had on this topic, from laymen up to A-list auteurs. Everyone has their opinion, and at this point, everyone's is valid. Can digital at times be too sharp and clear to the point of being somewhat unsettling? Yeah, absolutely. Can that be used with intentionality to create a desired effect? 100%. Does film have a natural physical intimacy that both separates and unites the audience with the work simultaneously? Without a doubt. Is film more costly, less convenient, and less capable in certain scenarios such as low light and fast action than digital? You bet. They are both at the peak of their capability now, especially with all the revivals of film in its various formats by the men and women at the top of their game in the industry that are willing to keep it alive, and each format has its place. They are tools in the toolbox of artists and should be viewed as such. If the greats like Christopher Nolan and Roger Deakins have such drastically different opinions on the film versus digital argument, yet both of them win Oscars and produce blockbusters as a result of their work with their chosen mediums, I think we can all agree that the argument at this point is rather moot. It's a style and a workflow choice, and one that should not be made lightly, but it is one that can be made without adverse effects on the final product if chosen wisely. This point is reflected by cinematographer Stephen Yeldon in Tomorrow's Filmmakers YouTube video titled Why Modern Movies Look So Clean and How to Fix Them. The Knives Out director of photography argues that the camera, i.e. data collection device, is just a step in the process, and it's, quote, what you do with the data that determines the look and feel of a given film, and I personally could not agree more. So if not the texture of the image, what about its capabilities? We keep hearing about HDR, HDR10, HDR10+, and all these different acronyms telling us the new world of visual and color representation, and with it, the complaints that HDR is making images look flat and dull. Is that the culprit? In Patrick Tomaso's Why Movies Don't Look Like Movies Anymore, he discusses the role of HDR in modern productions as he sees it. Now, I suggest you watch the entire video for better context. Tomaso compares modern filmmaking to that of an example in The Parent Trap, a movie from the 90s which is very colorful, contrasty, and rich. Shot on 35mm by cinematographer Dean Cundey, Tomaso argues that, compared to it, many modern films look flat, and cites high dynamic range as a contributing culprit, noting that not all can be put on the technology, as Cundey is a superb cinematographer, but there is enough there to warrant its notice. Tomaso then gives a brief history of early digital cameras and how their dynamic range was much lower, causing highlights to clip and blacks to become voids much more easily, this style being dubbed the video look. But now, with the advancement of digital cameras, they have such high dynamic ranges that it's killing the contrast because highlights never clip and blacks never go full black. He then adds Superbad into the conversation, shot on the Panavision Genesis HD, which had, quote, less dynamic range than an iPhone. He goes on to talk about pretty much everything but the lighting in the camera though, such as costuming, the production design of the red car, and the mahogany in the house and the brown carpet. But what stuck out to me is that none of that really has to do with dynamic range. These are production design elements that have contrast within the colors on set. Now, granted, their values will register in the camera darker and lighter, but again, that's more of design of the set and the costuming than it has anything to do with the cameras. The lower dynamic range of the camera that they use definitely helped to make things more contrasty given the lighting restrictions, but what provided most of the contrast was the lighting on set. They clearly chose very lightly bounced or screened light sources, still skewing far towards hard light as opposed to soft, causing there to still be pronounced shadows and highlights on the actors' faces and throughout the scenes. We'll revisit this lighting topic in greater detail shortly. But for now, if it's not the camera, then maybe it's the lenses that the cameras are using? In Tomorrow's Filmmakers video, the narrator discusses lens choice and how it can affect the final product of a film, using examples of films like The Batman, The Hateful Eight, and others that have used vintage cinema lenses for specific emotive feelings with their productions. He compares those films to modern productions like Rings of Power, The Witcher, and All Quiet on the Western Front, and more, specifically calling out ARRI lens families in particular, like the DNA series, for being pristine in color and in sharpness, adding, quote, imagine if All Quiet on the Western Front were shot like The Batman. What an immersive experience it would be. Specifically referring to the soft-edged anamorphics used for that production, as opposed to the pristine ARRIs in All Quiet. The problem I have with this argument is that it feels one-sided. I can understand enjoying the use of lenses with character in certain instances, but I don't think it's fair to say that All Quiet would necessarily be a better film, or at the least look better, had it used the same lenses as on The Batman. Now, I don't know the intent of the production staff, but I can assume based on the lens choice that for The Batman, the goal was to create a feeling of isolation in the film. The edges are soft because Batman is often our central focus, and their visual language communicates that despite inhabiting the world of the rest of Gotham, with all of these other individuals around him, he isn't truly a part of them. Similarly, with All Quiet on the Western Front, my reading of that choice would suggest to me that the point of the clarity of the image is to create the opposite effect. Our protagonist is in the moment. inescapably so. We see everything as he does. We see the horrors of trench warfare unaltered and unhidden because that's the point. Our protagonist can't escape it, and neither can we. Going back to a previous topic on this channel, the narrator mentions the REDNA lenses quite specifically, which we know from the Five Nights at Freddy's deep dive were chosen with a very specific intent, both practically and artistically, on that production, as I would imagine the same case was in All Quiet. Now, while I can certainly understand the preference for a certain type of visual style, I think it's important to recognize that lens choice is a choice. And speaking of choices, when it comes to dynamic images, arguably the most important is lighting. Now, forgive me here, but this should be somewhat expected. I want to get a little bit more technical here. Let's return to Tommaso's comments about dynamic range with Superbad. Patrick also states in his video that what makes a scene feel cinematic is the contrast between the light and dark parts of the image, and that he believes we are losing the talent and taste to be able to create such images. He gives an example of the film Seven by David Fincher, and how the remastered version is less contrasty, while Fincher's newer work is blander than that of his earlier films. Tommaso also argues that the most high-budget movies in the early 2010s were far more dramatically lit than the movies of today, using examples like 2013's Wolverine. Now, though he reassures us that he knows the technology is getting better and more accessible, he suggests that such a case could make it easier to avoid the dull, flat look that is prolific today, but then we circle back to the high dynamic range issue. For as high as the dynamic range is now on digital cinema cameras, the baseline exposure values are still way higher than they used to be with film. Minimum base usable ISO on most digital cameras is around 640 to 800 ISO, in terms of what is actually deemed usable by most industry standards. Now, standard film stock back in the 20th century was usually at as low as 50 to 100 ASA, or ISO equivalent. Now, if you were to try to replicate the film exposure look on a digital sensor, you would need a full 3 to 4 stops of ND filter to get down to that level of exposure with an equivalent T-stop on the lens aperture. This cuts the usable light dramatically, which is why back in the day, they needed so much more light than we do now. This is also why they used hard lights as opposed to massive soft sources, which are the standard on productions nowadays, because softening the light simultaneously cuts the light's intensity. In the 20th century, the near exclusive form of light that they had was tungsten, which produces a ton of excess heat in order to generate the light that they produce. So much so that even when I was in film school in the 2010s, one of my jobs as a PA on more than one set was to stand outside in the rain next to a massive tungsten light that was shining into a window with a gel on it to make sure that the soft source or the gel that was on it in front of it didn't catch fire. The job is literally called firewatch. This hazard, combined with the amount of light that would be needed to produce a usable exposure with a bounced or diffused source with tungsten, is what largely kept hard sources as the standard. Today, with vastly more efficient LEDs that produce way more light and way less heat, you can pour millions of lumens behind a giant screen with little to no worry about flames in order to get as soft of a source as you would like. But this brings up an issue of its own. If the bland lighting of today is simply a result of not having the choice to have soft lighting, since unfiltered or bounced sources are still completely possible, and tungstens are still around if people want to use them, then the real question is, why is this choice so prolific? There are 2 reasons for this. The first being artistic intention. Going back to the video of tomorrow's filmmakers, he states that in modern movies, quote, images are technically perfect, but just flat. And he goes on to discuss how great cinematography is all about depth and separation through lighting. To illustrate this, he uses clips from films with high-key lighting and focuses on Ticket to Paradise in particular, dissecting the lighting choices and the lack of sweating and squinting on the actors' faces, noting that the obvious systematic negative fill used to create depth takes the audience out of the experience and makes it seem like they aren't actually on an island. He then pivots to the film Emma, bringing up again the existence of increased elements of negative fill for close-ups that then cast shadow on an actor's face, causing lighting continuity discrepancies between each shot. And again, that being something that would then pull him as a viewer out of the immersion of the experience of watching the film. For contrast, he then goes back to a comparison again with The Batman, saying, quote, it was lit as if you were standing right there, but that The Batman can't look like films like Barbie, Elvis, or Ticket to Paradise due to, quote, audience expectations, but that The Batman definitively, quote, looked better. Now, here's the thing. The Batman is a beautifully shot film. Greg Fraser did an amazing job, and he is amazing at what he does, without question. But in terms of lighting design for the story, I wouldn't say it was necessarily better than Barbie, Elvis, or even Ticket to Paradise. Rather, that every single one of those films lit the production for what the story required. The Batman of all the films that we just mentioned is the most dramatic story. It's the only film where we actually see people die. Therefore, as a dramatic film, it calls for more dramatic lighting. Elvis, Barbie, and Ticket to Paradise are decreasingly less dramatic films, leaning more into the comedic with Barbie and Ticket to Paradise. With that shift in genre, tone, story structure, and overall production construction, these films benefit from a unique and deliberate approach to their lighting design. This is in no way different from films that were shot decades ago. Silence of the Lambs is a very dramatic movie, so it is going to be bathed in shadow and harsh light. 1988's Big with Tom Hanks is not as dramatic, again leaning more towards comedic, so it is going to have scenes with much brighter and balanced lighting. To bring up Seven again, that is an extremely dark film with a high level of drama, which again calls for rich blacks and harsh bright lights. When Harry Met Sally, rest in peace Rob Reiner, is a romantic comedy, which thus calls for a softer, brighter lighting. This isn't just audience expectations, this is artistic continuity across time, with completely different camera, lens, and light formats and options than today. When Harry Met Sally, by comparison to Seven, is technically a more flatly lit film, but you wouldn't call it a dull film. You also wouldn't want to light big like you would the Batman. It wouldn't make thematic sense. So there are times for shadows and contrast, and there are times for balance and brightness. But this brings us to the second, more poignant issue with modern lighting. And to discuss that, we're going to touch on Robert Tolpe's Netflix Lighting and the Death of Cinematography video. Tolpe starts by saying that though technology has gotten better, lighting strategy has gotten, in his words, worse. And he illustrates this by comparing the first Devil Wears Prada film to its sequel, in particular the elevator scenes. He attributes the flat lighting in the sequel to the streamlined production needs of streaming services that are producing so many more productions every year. And he then gives a brief history of lighting in film, which is very efficient and effective, so I highly recommend that you check that out. But on the issue of this specific example with the Prada movies, personally, other than color temperature and production design, I genuinely don't see that much difference between the two. There's slightly more highlight and shadow in the original, but even that is lit very soft for the most part. And you can see that they actually boosted the contrast by having the skin tones of the actors be far more on the orange side of the spectrum, giving them a bit of a tan as compared to their original design in the first film, probably again to add a little more contrast. And the lack of contrast stems primarily from the elevator in the new film being a dull gray, which is less of a reflection of a poor choice on the production design's part, but more of a reflection on where the world has gone in terms of interior design. There's a reason that the term millennial gray continues to persist. We can criticize the sterilization of environments in the real world at a separate time, but for a film that's trying to authentically reflect what the corporate world looks like today, it's not entirely on them for everything to look bland. Now, as Robert continues, he notes that the issue of softer and softer lighting has largely emerged as a means to hide possible blemishes on actors' faces, especially for women who are above a certain age, citing Meryl Streep and Anne Hathaway in this scene in particular. Now, this is, for better or for worse, 100% accurate. And it's also not unprecedented. As he mentions in the previous segment in the video, even in the golden age of cinema, they were shooting actresses with softer light than their male counterparts to hide blemishes due to the nature of the film stock at the time, and as we covered earlier in this video, the lights themselves, they were limited to how soft they could go. Now, this wasn't just a plan of the production staffs in the studios. This was actually often a requirement by the actresses themselves. A prime example of required lighting is in Joan Crawford, who not only requested specific lighting, but she actually had a gaffer teach her the technicalities of light and rigging so she could learn exactly what would make her look her best on the silver screen, and instruct production staff to follow her directions, or at the very least know immediately when they weren't. And, of course, correct them. And she made it work. If you look at just about any image of Joan Crawford throughout her entire career, the lighting is almost exactly the same, with defined shadows under the cheekbones and the faintest dark area under her nose. And this is no accident. This is a prolific technique in portrait photography called butterfly lighting, named for the shape of the shadow under the nose. It was used to accentuate the right features and hide everything else. On some productions, actresses would actually take it a step further, requiring that the lens focus either slightly before or after their face, causing their face to be faintly blurred, creating a dreamlike look while simultaneously hiding any blemish that they were concerned about being visible. Now, the modern version of this technique is on grand display in the Devil Wears Prada movies. These being these massive soft sources, as Robert notes, being at times 12 by 12 feet large. And for the most extreme examples, taking those 12 by 12s and stacking them next to and on top of each other, creating a massive wall of soft light. Roger Deakins, known for having some of the best lighting in history, including being incredibly dynamic and contrasty, often uses a technique of using 3 of these 12 bys in a semicircle with a light bouncing off of them in medium and close-up shots in order to achieve the proper softness and light roll-off on a face that he likes in his work. The larger these sources get, the fewer shadows you find, and as a result, the flatter the image is going to look. Now, the reason this is getting worse largely has to do actually with the cameras, in particular resolution. From HD to 2K to 4K, we've gone from crisp definition of characters on screen to being able to see every pore and flake of makeup on an actor in something as wide as a medium shot, which, for context, is what I'm in right now. And it's so pervasive now that at times it can be distracting for an audience. Where natural film grain used to create a barrier for the detail of a face in the pre-digital age, with crisp lenses and sharp resolution, cameras can now see everything. Now, for certain instances, this can be a massive benefit, but for women who might not want to show certain features of their face in grand detail, this poses a problem that stage makeup just can't solve. That flat lighting provides a solution. And another solution it provides is one for another problem on our investigative list: visual effects. Visual effects, or VFX, have been around since quite literally the first films ever made, initially starting as light and in-camera movie magic, and eventually graduating to the modern solution of computer-generated images, or CGI. As just mentioned, high-resolution video provides great opportunity for effective tracking and compositing in CGI-heavy productions, but it is in those CGI-heavy productions that many audience members claim to have a problem with it. This topic is brought up as a point of contention in the video Why Movies Just Don't Feel Real Anymore by the channel Like Stories of Old, which is a phenomenal channel. I watch a bunch of his videos. They're fantastic, but I'm going to use some of his points here to illustrate mine. In the video, he cites overly post-processed films and their numerous layers and elements of, as he puts it, overprocessing makes everything feel fake to the point of breaking the immersion. He actually also references Patrick Tomaso's Why Movies Don't Look Like Movies Anymore, and enumerates upon the idea further, citing how filmmakers are shooting for the edit, not prepping for the shoot, meaning that what they capture in the camera basically is the canvas from which they'll paint the film on later in post-production. Tomaso also notes in his video separately that they shoot bland and flat in order to ensure that they can adjust continuity and style in the edit. He then cuts to an interview with cinematographer John Matheson of Gladiator, Logan, and Jurassic World Rebirth, which happens to be one of the other films that Like Stories of Old is referencing in that video, and Matheson talks about how there is too much latitude to work with nowadays, and that the focus on lighting for green screen is much more prevalent than lighting just for the scene. This is a point echoed by Tolpe in his video, where he references the Wicked productions, noting that the only contrast in those shots are a strong backlight, which in and of itself is used as a means to assist artists in post to help separate the actors from the green screen behind them for more effective compositing. Tolpe also cites the footage as looking flat because many of the outdoor shots are a result of the overcast skies of the UK, where the productions filmed much of the scenes due to the tax breaks. He proposes then the theory that part of why films are looking as flat as they are now is because they're not being shot under the sunny skies of LA anymore, and that the HMIs used in an attempt to create sun within the overcast skies just don't have the power needed. Now, I personally think this is definitely a valid argument, though I don't know just how pervasive it is, considering that the main determining factor here is less where the production is being shot, but more why they're shooting it a certain way, such as for VFX, rather than the tax breaks. Tax breaks are important, but usually a production is going to focus primarily on what shots they need and then figure out where they can achieve those with the least amount of money. Tax breaks are part of that factor in the equation that come after figuring out what the production actually needs. Tolpe also adds that the completely CGI shots of the film look, at least subjectively to him, better, because the digital lighting used for the scenes is not confined to the practicality and limits of the production during shooting, allowing for adjustable hard and soft lights wherever and whenever the scene calls for it. Now, while I can certainly see this argument and agree with it at times, this is in direct conflict with much of the discourse around modern opinions of CGI. Like Stories of Old enumerates on this in his video with the ideas of indexicality, perceptual realism, and haptic visuality. He describes perceptual realism through a quote from Noel Carroll, saying that films with greater perceptual realism, quote, were more like ordinary perceptual experience, and argues that the more CGI in a shot, the less perceptually real they are, though he does provide an effective counterargument with the Avatar movies, which he notes are far more perceptually real than even some shot on location. To this I would add that I vehemently agree with both sides, because that perceptual realism is greatly dependent on the quality of the cohesion of the elements on screen, whether practical or digital. Avatar is a flawless example of digital cohesion. The level of quality of the animation and the compositing in Avatar films is so high that the elements on screen create a sense of perceptual realism. Now, part of what helps here is that everything on screen is CGI, whereas when you composite real people or objects into scenes with other CGI elements, the brain is pretty quickly and easily able to parse out which is what. So when one cohesive structure of CGI is in front of you on screen, your brain isn't going to be fighting recognition of two different tangible realities, so it'll be far more easily accepting of that perceptual realism. But as a counterpoint to that concept, an example on the opposite extreme would be that of the shark in Jaws. Though, especially looking back now, Bruce is a far cry from a living, breathing great white, it's the physical interaction with the real Atlantic Ocean, orca, and actors on scene that provided its own sense of unique perceptual realism. Part of why I find modern ocean-based films difficult to immerse myself in by comparison to films like Jaws or Master and Commander is a direct result of the uncanny digital water in most productions. Granted, it's a hard thing to master with just how complex water simulations are to generate, but that's why real seawater is so valuable in films on the ocean, especially the larger the scale that you can have it be. Now here again, Avatar is an exception, as the work they did with the water physics and simulation is astounding, but again, having everything be CGI on screen continues to help the cohesiveness of that perceptual realism. Like Stories of Old then goes on to discuss indexicality, and the philosophy of indexes and their correlated representations, and how physical celluloid film is an index of its subject in and of itself. He remarked that the direct link without interference is why some, with an indirect nod to Christopher Nolan, still view it as a more pure experience by comparison to digital. But to this as well, he also provides an effective and convincing counterargument, that plenty of films shot digitally have that sense of indexicality, and there are plenty of movies that shot on film that don't have it due to post-processing after the fact. And my simple addition to this would be that I agree, and for the digital part of the argument, just watch anything Roger Deakins has made in the last 20 years. His last point that I will mention, and I highly recommend watching his whole video for greater context, is haptic visuality. He covers a topic coined in Laura Marx's The Skin of Film, in which she discusses the sensory relationship an audience has with a film and a film experience. That with a movie, it isn't just visual, as, quote, the eyes function as organs of touch in their own unique way. She goes on to add that haptic looking discerns texture rather than immersively diving into the illusion. The narrator of the video adds that part of what provides a sense of haptic tactile reality in films are examples of shots that show objects touching each other in the world that are familiar to us as an audience. Even as simple as raindrops on a cab, like in Taxi Driver, providing a subconscious relativity to the image that we're seeing, or with familiar world elements like fire, wind, or others. Another example he provides in a film is The Sorcerer, where Roy Scheider is covered in sweat and lit with harsh light, evoking the visual and tangible representations of what it is like to be in that environment that he is inhabiting as the character, comparing this again to Jurassic World Rebirth, in which the characters do not visually show these kinds of attributes, being way too clean and pretty, another pervasive issue in his eyes of the modern film industry. Now, the counterpoint that I would argue to this is that the beautification in Hollywood has always persisted. Movie stars have always been largely gorgeous, and it has frequently been seen as a deviation from the norm to have more average-looking people in a picture, often being marked as contributing to immersion when people would do that, and this is long before CGI was an issue. A prime example is another previously mentioned Roy Scheider film in Jaws. Jaws takes place in the literal peak of summer, but we hardly see him glistening in sweat in that film. Though we do see him drenched in water later when the orca is sinking, but during the land sequences for the first half of the film, much like in Jurassic Park Rebirth, the heat of summer just isn't the central focus of the story, nor is it heavily thematically relevant enough to fixate on it. One could argue that the film would have been elevated even further if Spielberg had brought that into the concept of how he framed his shots, but I would say we could all agree that the film, as it stands now, does pretty well on its own as it is. Now, in terms of how all of this applies to the modern film industry at large, I think that all of the above is true. However, I would not ascribe this to a lack of wherewithal on the production's part, but rather to a supply of demand and the nature of the business as a whole. The fact of the matter is, box office drives budgets, and over the last 2 decades, box office has consolidated around films that are increasingly hyper-realistic, or quote, fantastical, as the narrator in Like Stories of Old puts it, when discussing the exaggerated background of Jurassic Park Rebirth, leading towards productions with greater use of CGI to create worlds and environments that go beyond what we might normally expect in our world, even if they are representing our world. Going back to the Tomorrow's Filmmakers video, and I totally forgot to script this part, so bear with me here. There is a direct comparison between the Batman and The Dark Knight. Now, his comparison is trying to suggest that the Batman was shot better, and it was more dramatic and things like that, but we won't get into that, but in terms of what we're discussing right now, those visuals next to each other, you notice a distinct difference, and that difference being that the Batman technically has that, quote, over-processed look in some of its even just basic cityscape shots. The comparison of the Gotham City skyline of, I think it was their equivalent of Times Square, to the Wayne Tower building and other elements of Gotham in Nolan's version, you notice that the Batman version clearly has significantly altered visuals with CGI. And this gives credence to the idea of progressing from realism to this hyper-fantastical realism that we're seeing. And that's over only just over 10 years. Getting back to the script, another comparison would be Transformers. Despite being incredibly CGI heavy, still felt relatively grounded in our reality, similar to the original Iron Man and 2014's Godzilla. However, since the time of those films' release, the films that have drawn bigger and bigger audiences to the box office are the films that exuded this sense of hyper-fantastical realism. If you take a look at the top 30 films at the box office in 2025, the vast majority of the highest-grossing films on that chart are either fully animated, or they're exuding this sense of hyper-realism through much of the film. And as a quick aside here, I think part of the reason for that is just, again, this heightened sense of drama. In the late 80s up until the late 2000s, we got a lot of really good films that were focused on smaller scale. Again, I'm going to be covering Heat soon. The Dark Knight I just mentioned, which was a direct reference to Heat in many ways. Jurassic Park in comparison to Jurassic Park Rebirth, as I believe, Like Stories of Old was comparing. You get these positions of filmmaking where you are reaching the limits of what you can visually create within the real world practically. The only way to advance your environment to create a sense of greater drama, of greater scale, is to make those environments and scales appear grander than that which you could find in the real world. So as a direct result of trying to ensure that audiences are not growing bored and they're still capable of being invested in the stories, as with pretty much everything else in the world, you need to keep growing, keep changing, keep evolving, and this is the way in which studios have found a means to do that. And our money at the box office has only confirmed their reasons for doing it. Now, what I need to stress about this next part is that films with these elements in them are not inherently bad films as a result, despite what I think the greatest double-edged sword for Hollywood would have you believe, and that is the discourse about these films on social media. We have known for years that social media creates feedback loops of negativity, not out of some intentional pursuit of evil, but simply because it makes money. It's just psychology. When people get angry, they engage. When people engage, they are subjected to ads. And when people see ads, companies make money. Therefore, social media companies optimize ways to make you angry so they can boost their profits. And this isn't even a new concept. Politicians have done this every single election cycle in the United States since the country was founded. During the elections just after Washington declared himself done with presidency and was going to retire to Mount Vernon, candidates were funding newspapers aligned with their parties to publish lies about each other in hopes to scare and anger the public enough to convince them to vote their way. The only exception to this practice was when we had the Fairness Doctrine between 1949 and 1987, where news was not allowed to be partisan, or if it were, they had to represent both sides fairly and honestly. Now, since the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine in 1987, editorialized broadcasting has swamped the media landscape. And unfortunately, as a result, this mentality and strategy has found its way into media discourse as well. Whenever a new Hollywood picture hits, every media platform is flooded with reactions and video essays about how horrible it is or how horrible it's going to be. And for over a decade, we've been berated with content about how Hollywood has lost a step, how they're out of touch, and how they don't know what they're doing, and that talent is going down the drain, etc. And I'll be honest, for a while there, I totally drank the Kool-Aid. In part because now working as a full-time YouTuber, which is still genuinely weird and hard to say at times, I have had very little free time to begin with. And partly because of the discord around films and what little I'd seen, I started to believe the claims. That was at least until this last Christmas season. When I was younger, I mainly rewatched the films that I grew up on, like Santa Claus is Coming to Town, The Polar Express, or any of the Tim Allen Santa Claus movies, who is still my favorite representation of the character, believe it or not, other than possibly Jim O'Heir as Santa 17 in the second season of Disney's The Santa Claus's Show, who literally looks exactly as if you took the Rankin Bass Santa and made him live action. Disney, I don't know what I have to do to get a Santa 17 prequel made, but I will do it. This is arguably the hill I am most fervently ready to die on, so let me know. Anyway, in college, I didn't have much time for holiday movies, and once I started working, even less so. It got so bad that last year, despite Christmas being my absolute favorite holiday, both for myself and as a heritage from my family, we are extremely Christmas-oriented people, I didn't even find time to decorate. Now, as a result of that and feeling horrible after that event last year, I made it a mission this year that I wouldn't become the quintessential Christmas movie protagonist who doesn't make time for his family during the holidays. I was going to be sure to carve out time to enjoy the Christmas spirit, and part of that meant watching Christmas movies. And for the first time in a long time, new Christmas movies. Now, across the entirety of the Christmas season so far, with my girlfriend and groups of friends, we ended up watching films like Fat Man, Last Christmas, Red One, Netflix's Klaus, and a bunch of others. And I'm going to tell you what I experienced from watching new films for the first time in a while. First on the list was Red One, which I completely dismissed as a result of basically every rock movie getting memed to death about being bad, the CGI being CGI, and just generally dismissing new movies on the whole as a result of the social media pollution. But we figured, you know what, it's the Christmas season, why not? Let's give it a try. I have to admit, within the first 10 minutes, I was absolutely hooked. Now granted, they were able to win me over relatively easily because I am from Philly, and seeing J.K. Simmons as Santa in the King of Prussia Mall transition to gargantuan reindeer being fed Philly pretzels, and then seeing Santa's sleigh get an F-22 escort out of PHL International, I'm sorry, but it's Christmas and my inner kid was screaming. But what followed only continued to entertain. Were the backdrops CGI? Yeah, clearly, but they were well done. And looking at most of the visual in the films, especially the action sequences, it was warranted. You could not get puppet reindeer to behave as the reindeer do in this film. You could not achieve the action shots in this film without great expense to budget, or more importantly, safety, without CGI. It wasn't overused, it was warranted. And a prime example of the lack of overuse was arguably my favorite character in the whole film, Krampus, played by none other than Tormund himself, Christopher Haivu? I believe that's how you pronounce his name. But anyway, he was great. His character design was almost entirely practical, and it looked absolutely fantastic. But they did it because it made sense for what the character does in the film. Next on the list was Fat Man. Now, Mel Gibson as Santa was absolutely something I was not expecting, but it was surprisingly fun. And I didn't even realize, despite having seen the occasional marketing material for this movie before it came out, that Walton Goggins was in this. I had no idea what the plot was, I had no idea where it was going, but had I known sooner, I'd have been all over this movie when it came out, and I didn't even realize until I was writing this script that that was 5 years ago. It is a really fun, gritty take on Santa and his lore that I would never have expected, and it was just a really unique opportunity for a story. Lastly is my personal favorite of the discoveries of this season, Netflix's Klaus. I am genuinely not kidding when I say I cried 4 separate times during this movie. Ironically, this is yet another case in which the big man is played by J.K. Simmons, and this is an incredibly touching take on the origins of Santa Claus. And, might I say, an absolutely stunning film. This is also Norm Macdonald's last work in film, voicing the comic relief boat captain throughout the picture. But for all those who criticize Netflix in particular for their lack of talent, inspiration, and storytelling ability, I challenge you to not be dazzled, warmed, or at the very least moved in some way by this beautiful film. From the character design, the lighting, the story, the voice acting, and especially the beautifully unique 3-dimensionalized 2D animation, it feels like a blend of 90s Disney with 2000s Pixar. I won't spoil the story, but this has absolutely become a staple of our household moving forward. Now granted, those were all subjective experiences, but it's still the winter Christmassy season, so I challenge you to watch these films. Come back and share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me how right or wrong that you think I am, and I'm gonna be more than happy to discuss the criticisms and camaraderie with you down there, because I really want to get people's opinions on modern movies, and these ones I think are good places to start, at least in my opinion. But assuming I'm not lying to you, this flies into the face of the idea that Hollywood is dying somewhat. So if it's true, if we're not doomed, but merely in a place of warranted adaptation and change, what can we do to keep improving our standing as both filmmakers and as an audience? First, for filmmakers, the most important thing I can suggest is to take risks, but know your limits. People in this industry literally cannot afford to risk their careers for their artistic vision on any given whim. It's idealized in a lot of like making ofs of different films, but in reality, it is not practical and it does not work out well for most people. Plus, it's an industry of compromise. It is a part of the business. Filmmakers have always struggled to have the power to execute their vision as they saw fit, and routinely have been required to make concessions and compromises to their vision for the sake of making their movie at all. Even the greatest talents in the industry struggle to make their vision a reality. This is actually a topic I was specifically able to ask Roger Deakins of all people in person a couple years back during his book tour for Byways. I asked him and James, after all of the phenomenal work that they've done and the Oscars that they've won, if they had any more authority in their work. Had they gained the immunity of criticism from executives? Or are they still pressured to make the compromises we're all too familiar with? Their answer? Laughter. Roger put his head in his hand with a gentle smile and he looked up and said, "On the last film we did, we spent an hour arguing with a producer about how the film was looking until we realized he had no idea what a LUT was, and I just had to walk away. Every day, on top of all the other things that go wrong anyway, we are constantly battling producers that want something completely different. It's always a compromise, and it never changes." Now, I followed that question up later with another, asking, despite all of the limitations throughout each step of the process that they face, what is their North Star? What is their central focus that keeps them guided on the right path? At first, James answered with a word that she has mentioned before in other interviews: story, clarifying that they never join a project that they aren't captivated by. And then Roger added a little bit of personal nuance. He elaborated that very early in his life, even before he really had a career in cinematography, he grew to realize and accept that he, and all people for that matter, have very little real control over their lives. At first, he didn't even intend to become a cinematographer, but the opportunity arose and he explored it. And he has kept that same mindset every day, at work and at home. It's why, despite clueless producers and the shackles of Murphy's Law, he still pushes through, because he sees the world as a chaotic possibility, and that the best way to navigate it, with any sense of direction, is to simply accept it as it comes and react in kind. In the words of Bruce Lee, be like water, my friend. Now, the second suggestion I would have for filmmakers, including myself, is a little bit more technical, and that is the idea of prioritizing rewatchability. Now, here I want to discuss a video by CinemaSticks titled "When the Director is Really Good at Their Job," and he spends most of the video discussing Steven Soderbergh's re-edit of Raiders of the Lost Ark in black and white, with no original dialogue or music, focusing on Spielberg's visual storytelling, specifically through blocking, framing, light, and particularly shadows. I highly suggest that you watch his video for a full analysis, and it was a prime reminder to me of just how much of a master Steven Spielberg is, in the sense that he can convey everything about a story just through the visuals alone. Now, the main element of that, of which I want to focus on, is within the scene where Henry and Marcus explain what exactly the Ark of the Covenant is to the government officials. In particular, the, quote, cinematic elements of which I borrow some of the ideas of perceptual realism previously explained by like stories of old. By today's conversational standard of movies, there isn't all that much contrast to make note of. The background is in deep focus and is mostly an empty hall, and this is in contrast to the prolific blurred background look that we see in today's cinema, and the scene is just four men existing around a table for the most part, talking, and yet it's still cinematic. How? Well, for one, it's the genius of Spielberg's blocking and framing, of which I will let Danny explain.
But it's his group shots that show off Spielberg's staging best. We've already looked at this one, but later, when Indy's explaining something important and all eyes and ears are on him, we get this, framing him alone in the corner, then this shot where we look where they're looking, and finally, when all four characters come together and are literally on the same page, we get this, and the foreshadowed book becomes the center of their attention.
Now that explanation is a prime example of why I think you should watch his whole video in greater detail. But in addition to the movement of the camera and the actors on screen, we have the production design, costuming, and lighting and lens choices selling the scene. Production design and lens because the deep focus lets us know where we are, a grand atrium at a university. The lighting is relatively natural for the setting, with great big stained glass windows. We're going to have multiple natural sources of light. Props and costumes in the scene inform us as to who these characters are, when this is taking place, and what they're discussing, even without hearing the dialogue or having context of a previous scene. Now, in addition to other elements he discusses through his video, the benefit of having more than one character in a scene at a time, and having a deeper focus in the scene as opposed to shallow, is not just providing the economy of shooting, at least when you're on a physical set with good production design and working with talented actors who can act several pages of dialogue in a row, without stopping or needing to do other takes, but it also provides a sense of rewatchability. And I'll explain what I mean by that. By the nature of how our eyes physically function, we have a very small window of what we can actually focus on at any given time. Even if you're committing what most filmmakers would consider the cardinal sin of an audience, that being watching a film on your phone screen, you can still only focus on a given portion of even that small of a screen at a time. When you have shallow depth of field and you're working in medium shots or close-ups, similar to the representations that Like Stories of Old references, you're drawing the attention of the audience to the face of that singular character. For the points in which the emotions on that character's face are paramount for the scene, and where it requires the focus be on that location, this is useful. However, in most scenarios, especially with modern audiences, you're losing the amount of information that the audience can retain, even if that information isn't directly relevant to the story of that shot. One of the major benefits of older movies with deeper focus, such as Raiders or Jaws, is that even if the story dictates focus on a given character in the scene, the director, in these instances Spielberg, provides the audience with the opportunity to look elsewhere, to gather supplemental information to support the story about things that are going on in other portions of the frame. This is why, after having watched the film literally over 50 times in my lifetime, I still find myself discovering new things that I've never noticed before when rewatching Jaws. When you take away the depth of a scene, you limit the audience's ability to maintain a sense of discovery every time they rewatch the film. And if the audience has every part of the story directly communicated to them on first viewing, they have little reason to rewatch. And speaking of the audience, they are not wholly innocent in this dichotomy either. That being said, what can we do as viewers to help the industry make more of what we say we want to see? The first thing I would suggest is to actively look for movies. Do the research. Find a film that's coming out or already in theaters and find out who the director is, who's in it, what the story is, and what studio made it. Part of doing this is knowing what and who to listen to. We don't live in the world of Siskel and Ebert anymore. The closest thing that we have to that is Mike and Jay from Red Letter Media. The market is so saturated, and it's hard to get a grip on who's worth listening to anymore. Now, if you can find someone that resonates with you, that is phenomenal. They are out there, and I have a few personally, but if time is tight for your schedule, just like with creators, I recommend taking the risks of your own. Now with that, I have to acknowledge that we live in a tough time right now. The economy is in the toilet, and work is getting harder to find, and just food alone is insanely expensive. But if you were lucky enough to still have some disposable income or time, and you're someone who values movies, even if you aren't completely swayed by any research you've done with the time that you have for a given film, I implore you, take the risk and go to the theater. Even if you're the type of person that wishes that studios would make more original films, it doesn't matter how much you say you want it unless you actually buy a ticket. Studios rarely listen to words. There are occasional exceptions in which things can happen like what occurred with the Sonic movie, but on the whole, they almost exclusively listen to dollars. And where you put those dollars is where they will reinvest them. And part of why I say take the risk is because you don't even have to like the movie. Hell, sometimes the most fun experience about a movie is walking out of the theater with a date or a group of friends laughing at how bad it was. Now, to be clear, making films is incredibly hard. And I think we can all agree that we want every film to be a masterpiece. But sometimes the pieces just don't fit. And that's okay, especially from the perspective of an audience. You have to reformat how you look at a trip to the cinema. You aren't going there to consume a product of an exactly specified form. You're taking a chance on an experience, and you're letting yourself slip away into another world for 2 hours, give or take. It's far more akin to trying out the corner dive bar of some random town that you happen to be passing through than going to a Michelin star restaurant to get a full 5-course meal. You really never know what you're going to get, but that's okay. In my opinion, that's part of the fun. Filmmaking is complicated, and the world even more so. But enjoying movies can and should be simple. It's not always easy, given the confines of the world, but at the very least, simple. So when you can, stop by your local theater, pick a random movie, buy a ticket, and enjoy the adventure into another world for a little while. Maybe you'll like it, maybe you'll hate it. But at the end of the day, you've had a new experience. And isn't that the whole point of living? Now, I know this was a different style of video than you've come to expect with this channel, and it was different than I anticipated making. But for better or worse, the Heat video that I was planning has proven to take far longer than anticipated. With the holidays and conflicting schedules of collaborators, it's been really hard to get all of the pieces aligned to get you the product that I know you deserve and the one that I want to give to you. But I didn't want to leave you all hanging entirely, so I wanted to do something. And with how much this topic has been covered lately, and the counter-arguments that I've had in my own head, I thought it would be a good exercise in film literacy and production recognition as a whole. Granted, even this ended up taking way longer than I anticipated and ended up being a bigger project than I would have expected in and of itself, but I hope you enjoyed it nonetheless. I do plan to get you that Heat video sometime in mid-January, ideally, and I'm really excited to have that done and published. But until then, I appreciate you stopping by, and I hope you enjoyed this exploration into the world of modern filmmaking and where we're really going. Hopefully we continue to see things improve. Hopefully people are a little bit more willing and a little more capable, realistically, of going to the theaters and supporting the types of movies that they say they want to see, but only time will tell. So for now, let's just keep exploring in whatever ways we can together. My name is Aiden, and I hope to see you next time here on Silver Retention. Thanks for watching.